The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello and welcome back to the Storyology podcast, where I, materials scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Podajski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and storytelling. We're currently at the stage of science communication where the science gets published. Last episode, we heard about how this system works and the many problems with it. We heard how the so-called publish or perish culture leads researchers to break up significant pieces of work into smaller chunks so as to be able to publish more papers out of it, and how, in order to demonstrate the impact of their work, researchers write in a way that is easily quotable. Perhaps more starkly, the competition leads researchers and publishers alike to prioritise discoveries and positive findings over publishing negative or null results. This episode, we're going to be looking at the role of storytelling in all this. You might think that storytelling and scientific papers are worlds apart. After all, stories are made up, fiction, drama, whereas scientific papers should be objective truth. But if you think about telling a true story or a story that is based on real life events, then that gets a bit closer to the task at hand for scientists when they come to communicate their research. A series of true events strung together in a past tense narrative. The challenges that researchers have when writing these stories is that they're attempting to turn what is an inherently messy and non-linear true version of events into a clean, easy to follow and linear narrative. And this is where storytelling comes in. This episode, we'll hear expert evidence from researchers, Alex, Clara and Jess, as well as Pen, who you met last episode, who studies the research process itself. We'll also hear from Nicky Dean on the journal's side. To kick things off, here's what Pen had to say when I asked him, where does storytelling come into scientific publishing?
I think there are several ways of looking at this. So the first one is that even before we get into a lot of the problems we've been talking about today, storytelling is actually one of the things that drove me to scientific research in the first place. Because I have this innate curiosity about how the universe works, how things in the universe work. And I am excited, once I satisfied that curiosity, to tell the story about how that little part of the universe works that I just figured out. And I think that's really fun. And that's what drove me to do a lot of the science engagement and outreach that I've done in the past. Because I think, once you figure out, something, how the universe works, that is a story that you are telling other people. So there's that part. And then when it comes to, the day-to-day pressures of what we have to face, at least as academic scientists, and maybe more broadly, researchers in general, we are very much pressured into telling stories in certain ways. And there are some stories that we just don't have any space to tell. And this comes back to how competitive the system is, and this religious devotion to the, dogma that research must be built on competition, and for me to win, someone else has to lose. This causes so many negative externalities where an individual might, quote unquote, win in the short term, get a paper published, get a grant, but we all lose over the long term because it really prevents progress. And to put this more concretely, is that me as a researcher, I constantly have to show and demonstrate how successful I am. So I cannot talk about my failures. I cannot talk about the dead ends in my research, or just things I'm doing out of curiosity. All of that are losing prospects if I tell the story of my research. And I think that is a big shame. And it is preventing us not just from progressing intellectually, but progressing on solving so many of the big problems in the world today.
So there's no point in doing science if we don't communicate it to other scientists and the wider public. And, as Pen says, to communicate science is to tell stories. But which stories scientists choose to tell are another matter. The competition and pressures that we heard about last episode impels scientists to prioritise success stories over failures. I was curious about the thought process that governs how scientists actually select what data to use and what story to tell. Alex illustrated this well.
So I think my old boss, who I did my PhD with, was very much, he would always kind of say, well, what's the narrative to this paper? What is the story? And whilst we're probably not using story in the same way as kind of a novelist, definitely what was the process by which this research was realized, and then talking through those steps in quite a logical way. And he always had this kind of concept of, well, in your paper, if you have 5 figures, the last figure should be the punchy one that really shows that is the kind of the wow moment at the end. And the other figures kind of build to that and provide the kind of the tension of, won't they achieve this? And then when the final one comes through of, actually, we did make a lateral flow device for COVID. That is so much cheaper than everyone else's. Bang. I think that is the kind of the narrative and the story. And I think looking back at the papers I've written, hopefully that comes through. And you've certainly through reading them, it feels like you're more carried through reading that paper. And you actually understand why we're making the decisions we're making. And the data we don't directly refer to still goes in there. It goes in the kind of the supporting information with some explanation of why we did it. But just focusing on those key points and why we did those steps and why we made those decisions, rather than just kind of going, well, we made this compound and we did this, and this. And kind of like, that's great. We're 2 pages in now, and I still don't quite understand why you're making this or what you're doing. And it just makes it so much easier to read if you do have some narrative and some structure. Even though I think there are some colleagues who really dislike doing that. It almost goes against them as kind of scientists of, no, we're not artists, we're not storytellers, we're scientists. And it's kind of like, hang on. But if you write it in this style, more people are going to read and engage with it. And ultimately, isn't that the aim of why we do science, for more people to use it? So I think there is this, again, there's this tension, right?
So yes, there's a tension between the full truth of the entire messy process and telling a good story. And that inevitably necessitates stripping out a fair amount to find the story in the noise. Alex described how he often helps other researchers achieve this in the role of peer reviewer.
Sometimes on kind of reviewer comments, I have said, the science is very good, but this just reads very poorly. And tried to kind of suggest actually, you can probably strip back quite a lot of what you're telling me and provide a lot of that information in the ESI, because I know you've done it. I don't need you to explain every single data point to me. I want you to tell me the key data points that I should care about and why this matters. I think that ultimately makes research much easier to read and more accessible, rather than being these kind of very sort of huge 40-page papers where every single cell culture experiment is explained in huge detail. And you're sitting at the end of it going, I don't really understand why you're doing this 20th experiment when you proved it a long time ago. What's the application? I think it's almost kind of defensive science in the way that some people write. Certainly sometimes with some of my publications where we have patient data, well, not patient data in the sense of kind of who they are and GDPR stuff, but more as in where we've tested diagnostics with patients, you end up generating a lot of data, and that becomes like 100, 200 pages of ESI. And sometimes that can feel quite defensive, and that you kind of, well, they can't possibly disagree with our paper because there's 200 pages worth of supporting information. And you do kind of, about the same time, you want to write a nice paper. And I think sometimes, you sometimes do read certain papers and they just don't flow. They just don't read well. And I think sometimes actually it comes to the detriment of the science because you don't understand why they're doing it. Or you get halfway through and have to look back at the abstract to try and remember why you're actually reading this paper.
Defensive science is interesting to me. It reminds me of what the experts were saying about competition in science. Not only are scientific researchers trying to get ahead, but a skeptic might interpret defensiveness as defending yourself against other scientists trying to take you down. So you end up including everything and the kitchen sink in order to avoid criticism. But in doing that, you sacrifice the story. An alternative strategy came from Jess, which was to give yourself permission to somewhat rewrite history in the name of good storytelling.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I find that really funny. Like, we had a call about it the other day. Actually, it was about a different paper, but with some of the same people. And like, we see this kind of mental thing, and then we go and measure it a little bit more, and everyone's like, oh, is it as exciting as we think? Or, oh no, we're actually seeing this completely different physical process to what we started out thinking we were seeing. And then instead of telling the story where we're like, actually tell the honest story about the process of doing the science, instead you repitch it and you're like, we were looking for this crazy physical process, which is absolutely not what we were looking for. But, you know, and we had this call where we were like, how do we package the story and how do we tell it? And I was like, I mean, well, we obviously don't do the second way because that is obviously not right. And everyone else on the call was like, no, we do it the second way. Like, that's how we do it. So it's just, you know, even within people who you've worked with for a long time and you think, you know, everyone has really different opinions. And I don't know, I find it exciting. My one thing is just, I like reading papers that are really well written. Like I like reading papers that are really good story. I reviewed 2 papers today that are just so badly written and there's no narrative and there's no real analysis. They're just like stamp keeping. And then I just think, what is the contribution to the world?
This idea of assessing and reassessing the story of the research as you go along in order to refine your ideas is one that I think actually really benefits the researcher. Clara described how that manifests for her.
If I'm honest, the thing that cemented a lot of where I am now was speaking about those results at a conference. Because once you go to a conference, you've got to get your story across. And in order to do that, you've got to know what the most interesting stuff is. So I think that it goes hand in hand. There's papers and presentations. And I think that both of them really help focus you to figure out what you've got. And then you can go back and be like, oh, okay, so actually this was really interesting. This was giving us something. Or you probably didn't quite do the analysis. It's one of these things, you should always do the analysis as you're going along. But the truth is, I've been developing different techniques, you know, not brand new techniques. You know, maybe other people have got them, but they're new to our lab. And so then once you realize and you look back, and I had some graphs in April, and you know, a few months ago, and I was like, oh, there's a story here. Is there a story here? I need to get those extra data points, or is it just that it is a bit, you know, it's within the scope of error? So it is quite an iterative process, and you're going backwards and forwards a little bit. And so that's why it's quite important to think of, you know, the end goals. Is this a paper? Is this a presentation? Because that'll help you come back and feed it round, and it's going to be iterative. But again, like you say, it's not linear, because chances are you'll put a lot of effort getting that first result. But once you've got that first result, maybe you can get 10 results within the next 10 days. But it sort of ebbs and flows, and it looks like it's one even constant journey, but it isn't. Chances are that in a paper, all the work that you've done, it was all done in 2 weeks, but it took you 3 years to get there or something.
So storytelling isn't just a way of communicating research. It's actually an integral part of the research process itself. All of this reminds me of something that Philip Pullman writes in his book on storytelling, Demon Voices. One of the chapters of the book is an essay, which is actually a transcribed speech that he gave, called The Path Through the Wood, How Stories Work. In it, Pullman basically says that all stories are made from forests. The trees represent all the possible characters and scenes and events that you might include. And the narrative is the path that you take the reader on. The narrator's job is to choose that path. There are some trees in that forest that you know are there, but you never actually need to see. To take the reader around all of the trees would be lengthy and, as Alex put it, defensive. There are near infinite paths that we could take through the forest, and good storytellers develop an instinct for which path to take their reader on, depending on what outcome they're trying to achieve with the story. As journal editor Nicky told me, different paths through the wood are needed in different types of papers.
So, and I think you have to bear in mind that there's how we think about this in the context of publishing scientific research findings, and then how we think about it in the context of narrative review articles, where we're trying to provide an overview of recent developments in a particular field or on a particular topic, or if we're trying to write scholarly opinion pieces that are meant to inform and persuade people in order to affect some other kind of change, which is typically maybe more to do with that scientific environment, the practice of science, but also perhaps how people are approaching certain problems or thinking about particular things that then is maybe one level removed from actual claims. And the way that you think about story and narrative within those broadly two different domains is necessarily quite different, because they're ultimately trying to inform different people in different ways.
I asked Nicky to expand on those different motivations and use of story.
I think when you're looking at the publication of research findings, you are having to think very carefully about what your claims are and what is the evidence that you are presenting. That's new evidence, right? It's things that you have from the fruits of your research labors, so other people haven't seen it. You're making claims and you're trying to convince people that you have now understood some mechanism, or that you have found an association between two things that has important impacts. So there you have to think very carefully about, there is a story within that is typically to do with, like, what's the motivation for what you were doing? What's the problem you're trying to solve? What is the knowledge gap that you were hoping to fill? How did you do that? And what did you find? And then are you doing that in ways that your peers are going to find compelling, right? That they understand the logical sequence of things that you did, so you are taking them along that journey of discovery, and you are providing very strong evidence, and you're able to kind of rule out, say, alternative hypotheses. You're having to be very clear about your assumptions, what are the limitations perhaps to what you've done, and be clear about those things, but also convincing of the importance of the work. And there are challenges to that. I work at the nature journals, so we have these, we're highly selective. We're trying to publish what we think are the most important findings within any given topic. So the way people often look at this is that they think that means we only want to see things that are like exciting and high impact and controversial or similar, and that's not really the case. We are looking for things that are important and exciting, but that are also like very rigorous and well evidenced. And so there's, I think, for some people, a conflict between those two things in how you present that story, right? But fundamentally, to me, it's about thinking very carefully about your evidence, building that case, and presenting a story that people feel this makes sense, and if I poke it, it reacts in a way I expect, and they've clearly covered out somehow what are the missing elements? What are the controls? Have they thought carefully about these things? And so, okay, yeah, I buy this piece of work because now once it's published, the idea is people are going to try to build on it. And it doesn't mean it's correct in that this is now completely established fact and is something true we've revealed about the working of the universe. This is our best understanding of this phenomenon, and this is what we think based on these things. And now now there's got to be a conversation in the scientific community about that and test it and appraise it and build on it. If you look at that other side, that opinion side, and I guess I work a lot in this more since I was on Nature Energy and now with the portfolio of journals I have.
So for a piece where you're publishing new findings, you're writing a story that's both informative and persuasive. And for opinion pieces or reviews, Nicky says there are also different stories available.
If you look at that other side, that opinion side, and I guess I work a lot in this more since I was on Nature Energy and now with the portfolio of journals I have, we're looking at a lot more kind of societal challenges. So we're dealing with lots of people working on climate change, air pollution, decarbonization, food systems, inequality, lots of things like that. And so there are different types of opinion that people want to put forward that are dealing with these very complex issues that have big impacts and implications for wider society, potentially. And there, I think, we still want to see things that are evidence-based, but now people are drawing on established literature, for example, or other sources. They're not dealing with primary data anymore that they have collated. They're dealing with what is the evidence out there. And there's a lot more potential there for people to be sculpting particular narratives. And part of our job is to make sure that those are not overly biased, such that the opinions can be readily dismissed. We're not hoping to publish things that we're not seeking to publish things that everybody agrees with, because that's not moving the discussion forward. But we also don't want things that are just too flimsy. So the challenge now is that you have to have pieces that are written that are compelling, that highlight important issues or problems or challenges that this community has to face, either as academics or that say they're looking at policy problems. So they're now trying to communicate to a policy audience. And they want that to then be taken seriously. So they're needing to pull on useful pieces of evidence out there. But how do they do that in a way that doesn't seem like they're presenting too much bias, even though they might be being quite selective in the case that they're making. And so those require different checks and balances. And they have very different audiences. And I guess that's a key factor in all of this. You're writing scientific papers to be understood by scientific experts. A lot of what we're looking at with some of the opinion pieces are things that might be targeted at a general scientific audience where the expertise they have isn't important, but they might also be seeking to have wider influence with some other important stakeholder. And so the type of language, the type of argumentation has to be very different in order to have that intended impact.
So scientific publishing is a system where storytelling is an integral part of how scientific research gets done and how scientists communicate it to each other and the wider public's understanding of it. The actual research is really only half the process. The other half is the story that you choose to tell about it. And in writing that story, the scientists themselves also make better sense of the work. In crafting that story, researchers may strip out details that impede the flow of the narrative. These might be failures or dead ends, or they may be truths about the real expectations or questions that they were really asking at the start of the work, which turned out to be wrong. And most importantly, publishers know that all of this is going on in the author's head. In fact, they themselves encourage storytelling, and editors act as co-narrators to help scientists tell the best version of the story while still maintaining some sort of rigor. So what can we take from all this? That scientists are operating within a flawed system in which story plays an integral part. In my view, it's vital that researchers understand how story operates, not only so that they can communicate their own work better, but so that they can appraise other people's stories and spot whether story is doing too much heavy lifting, overpowering the scientific truth. But there is hope for change in this flawed system, and I want to give the last word to Pen.
I have to admit to you, sometimes I wake up in the morning, I look at myself in the mirror, and I would feel, tremendously dejected and feel that these problems are so big that we can't solve them. Whatever I do is the equivalent of taking a little spoon and scooping little bits of water out of a sinking ship. However, I also try to remind myself that if we can come together and look at our common problems together and think about solutions that we can do, then what that would give us would be these tools lying around. What I mean is that at least we can come up with shovel-ready solutions so that one day, if someone in power finally says, oh my God, this is so bad, we have to do something, we have to change, we have a ready-to-go solution so that they can implement it. And that is so important because if we are on a sinking ship, we want to be ready, right? We want to at least know where the flares are, or how to operate the radio, so that just in case we see, the lights of another ship passing by off in the distance, close to the horizon, we know, that we have the solutions in place to save ourselves, right? I sometimes hear really pessimistic, people saying, oh my God, the academic research system is so corrupt. It's all going to come crashing down. Now, let's say even if, that happens, rather than a catastrophic crash, can we at least turn it into a controlled landing so that we can turn it into an opportunity to apply some of these solutions? And I'm so inspired by so many people who are trying to tackle not just these problems, but by practicing some of these possible solutions, which I think you might be hearing from some of the other people you talk about how we change how we tell the stories of our research.
It's those ready-to-go solutions that we're going to hear about next episode. This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded programme. All of the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals and don't necessarily represent those of their employers. I've been your host, Anna Pajajski, and if you want to read more about my work around science and storytelling, head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.